Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming along today, and particularly thank you to Merle Heinrich and the Heinrich Foundation for making this possible. Perhaps I should start by just explaining the catalyst and the rationale behind the book. I moved back to the United Kingdom after 20 years or so in Asia in 2012. And from observing the political discourse in the UK, it became increasingly apparent to me that there was this void of ignorance about the way in which trade and economic engagement with China was shaping the social and political agenda of the time in the United Kingdom. And it struck me that this reluctance to join the dots between globalization and particularly economic engagement with China and the problems that were being faced in not just the UK, but obviously Western society at large, was leading potentially to multiple policy errors and errors of judgment. And it was clear also that we were risking the very foundation of freedom in the West, and that the rise of populism in Europe, the election of Donald Trump in the United States were manifestations of a real ill in the global economic architecture. And so that was the rationale behind the book. And the title, why has the West's economic engagement with China failed? And in summary, it was this, that the West entered into this sort of unconditional engagement on the wishful thinking, perhaps, or the assumption that there would be a convergence of political and economic norms as a result of bringing China into the global trading system and a rules-based regulatory trade environment, and that China would move away from a mercantilist planned economy, and that as a result there would be mutual benefit in this economic engagement. But in reality, in my view, there has been no such progress at all, and far from it. The consequence of economic engagement with China has been incredibly debilitating for Western societies. The corporates have benefited enormously. Corporate profits have risen as share of GDP. Labor, on the other hand, has been denigrated. And the combination of deflationary global trade with a policy of inflation targeting has actually removed the benefits of global trade from the consumer and the ordinary citizen and passed them on to the economic elite in the West. And so two elites have done very well out of this relationship: the Communist Party of China and the 1%, if you want to call them that, in the West. But the legacy that we're leaving is one of debt, financial fragility, unparalleled levels of income and wealth inequality, and most importantly, disillusionment and political discontent, which runs the risk of rising populism and bad decision-making. And just to elaborate slightly on the logic flow from this, when China came into the world trading system, it created enormous deflationary supply-side shock. And the big policy error, in my view, was not recognizing this for what it was. And so Western policymakers then embarked on policies of trying to stimulate demand in the West to fight off deflation. But there was no lack of demand. It was a supply-side shock. Western countries were already running large current account deficits. And so inadvertently, what policymakers were doing was really stimulating the Chinese economy. And in doing so, taking on more levels of debt. Rising asset prices have resulted in greater wealth inequality and great intergenerational wealth inequality. Growth has been very lopsided in Western economies. And the result is falling participation rates in property ownership, for example. And of course, if the younger generation don't own property, then they have no interest in protecting property rights. And they start to get disillusioned and disengage from the sort of liberal economic model that, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, looked as though it was unassailable and going to dominate the world. So if we just go back and look at the moment of the decision and the motives behind this move to unconditional engagement with China, and what was each side expecting out of this, this move. From the Western side, I think the expectations are best summed up by Bill Clinton, and in the book I refer to his speech that he made at the Johns Hopkins University in the aftermath of permanent normal trade relations being granted to China, where he outlines this vision of exporting the liberal economic model to China. And reading the speech now with the benefit of 17 years or so of hindsight, what strikes you about it is the naivety, the hubris. Obviously, victory in the Cold War had bred this assumption that given the choice, every society would wish to be free and move to the sort of liberal model, the Washington consensus, if you like, for want of a better word. But behind the politics of WTO accession from the Western point of view was this, in my view, pernicious corporate lobbying, which meant that sectional interests were being promoted above national interest. And what multinationals wanted out of WTO accession was to be able to take advantage of the greatest labor arbitrage in history and to secure access to what they hoped would be the largest market in the world. But what was China's motivation? Well, from the mid-1990s onwards, the low-hanging fruit of economic reform in China had been plucked and the benefits had been had. And economic reform was becoming more contentious. It was producing losers as well as winners. Resources had been hopelessly misallocated. And what China was looking for was a sort of panacea to these economic problems, a silver bullet, if you like. And what was very apparent was that they needed access to foreign technology, foreign know-how, foreign direct investment. But also, political events had highlighted the vulnerability of the export model to public opinion and world events. And so, by tying themselves into WTO and guaranteeing themselves permanent access to global export markets, the hope was that they'd be able to export their way out of a period of poor growth and buy themselves time to restructure the economy. So when you look at what happened in the subsequent years, what became apparent was that there were four factors in China's makeup that made it unique, and these were the factors that the Western leaders should have been focusing on during the WTO accession process, in my view. The first is obvious: scale. Ask anyone for a fact about China and they'll say it's a big place with a lot of people. But perhaps what was missed was that we were letting 650 million workers into the global economy at a time when we'd already had a warning signal about the potential deflationary and pernicious deflationary impacts of globalization. The bursting of the Japanese bubble in 1989 had been very deflationary. We'd had the Asia crisis, which had morphed into a global emerging market crisis from 97, 98, 99. And already central banks were starting to struggle to generate inflation, and the side effects of trying to generate inflation were blowing asset bubbles. So, for example, the TMT bubble in the world, I would argue, was a function of the global emerging market crisis and the monetary response to that. The second issue was the price at which China was entering the global trading system. Wages at the time were 1/30 of the price of manufacturing wages in the Western world. So 650 million people as a working age population, rising to 1 billion people going forward, coming into the global trading system at 1/30 of the price. So it should have been fairly apparent that the prospects for wage growth in high-cost economies were precisely zero, and that this was going to have an enormously deflationary impact on labor in the high-cost economies. The third issue, though, was the monetary architecture that existed in China, and that there was no insistence that this changed. Because when China came into WTO, the most important price in the world would become the RMB US dollar exchange rate. But it wasn't going to be a market price, it was fixed. Capital was not going to be allocated along market mechanisms because the financial intermediation industry was state-owned. And the whole political economy was statist. And so when you look at the debates about WTO accession and the debates about the terms, what you'll see is that they are remarkably microeconomic. You know, is the telecom industry going to be opened up? Is the banking system going to be opened up to foreigners? And what these microeconomic conditions reflected was the lobbying power of the various industries who were behind the Western administrations in that negotiation, whereas the real focus should have been on the overarching macroeconomic architecture of the Chinese economy. Now, China got pretty much everything it wanted in the sense that they were able to execute on this opportunity with enormous efficiency. Prior to WTO accession, the World Bank published a report called China 2020, and it makes almost comical reading now when you look at the forecasts that they made. But extrapolating the performance of the mid-1990s forward, they concluded that in a best-case scenario, China would grow at about 10% per annum in nominal US dollar terms going forward. In reality, China's delivered 15% CAGR growth for the 17 years in nominal US dollars. Now, that might not sound like much, but actually what it results in when you compound that over a 17-year period is an economy that is twice as big as it was forecast to be. So according to the World Bank, the Chinese economy around now would have been about $6 trillion instead of the 12 that it actually is. And the rest of the world has underperformed their expectations. So we have a much larger Chinese economy than was forecast to be. Exports grew at a 30% compound annual growth rate for 7 years. It meant that exports went from 250 billion to $1.25 trillion in 6 years. So exports in 2007 were as large as the whole economy had been in 2000. So China clearly executed on this phenomenally well. Their share of global manufacturing value added quadrupled from 6% to 24%. So if China was a company, you'd have the antitrust people crawling all over them now saying you've got a monopolistic grip on manufacturing. The rise in foreign exchange reserves reflected the degree to which China was operating its mercantilist model and highlights the big mistake in letting them in with a fixed exchange rate rather than a floating one. And the tripling of FDI from 300 billion in the preceding decade to $1 trillion in the subsequent decade highlights the degree to which the multinationals that had lobbied so hard for WTO membership for China were prepared to capitalize on it and invest in China for their own benefit. And so what was China's comparative advantage? And I put that in inverted commas there. I mean, it was low costs in labor, environmental standards, safety standards, input subsidies, tax advantages. The export engine of China was operating, pursuing national goals and was able to purloin the resources of the state in order to achieve those goals. And it was a very successful model because it was an unfair model. You know, the law prohibited Western companies from competing with them, even if you had agreed as a worker that you were prepared to take the 97% salary cut. The law would have prevented you from doing so in many cases, and obviously on the environmental standards and what have you. So China was able to capitalize on this, and it's a reflection, I think, of the power of the multinational lobby group that this engagement went ahead on the terms it did. Now, of course, you could argue that this was a price that had to be paid, but the upshot of this was that China was going to converge on Western norms. But when you run through the checklist, the yardsticks, if you like, by which one would like to measure the way in which China might have converged on the West, I think it's fairly evident that we're as far away from a market economy in China now as we were before. Markets depend on the a lack of coercion, on a willing buyer and a willing seller. They depend on the rule of law. They depend on the free and unbiased flow of information. Private sector companies cannot be expected to compete with state-owned companies. That is an unfair contest to set up. Has been very little progress in opening the financial intermediation industry and the allocation of capital to market forces. Exchange rate flexibility remains elusive. China continues to score very poorly on measures of market openness and investment openness. So the mercantilist model, in my view, remains intact. And the consequences, the first order consequences of this engagement should have been very predictable. That relative prices around the world changed very rapidly. So the relative cost of labor fell. The relative costs of manufacturing goods fell. The relative costs of commodity prices, of course, rose, ephemerally at least. So that, broadly speaking, transferred wealth around the world in a way that was unforeseen, towards Russia, obviously, from hydrocarbons, Russia and Iran, away from Mexico and Central Europe, which were geopolitically important areas for the European Union and for the United States. But the biggest shift and the most pernicious shift was the rise in the return to capital and the fall in the return to labor. And this was the change that, in my view, has had this debilitating impact on Western society. You can see here what the chart shows you is the rise in corporate profits relative to GDP and the fall in labor share of GDP. And this is where the discontentment comes from. If we look at the 20 years running up to China's accession to WTO, corporate profits averaged a little over 5% of US GDP. In the subsequent 17 years, they averaged 9.2% of GDP. That adds up to a $10 trillion transfer to corporates, the windfall for corporates as a result of this relative change in the pricing power. On the other hand, you have a $5 trillion shortfall in wages cumulatively over this period. So if you want to know why global trade has lost popularity, it's because the benefits have not been shared around. Now, the usual argument in favor of trade with China, from the consumer's point of view, has been, well, the consumers have benefited enormously from cheap goods, that washing machines are cheaper as a result, that TVs are cheaper as a result, clothes are cheaper as a result. And that as a result of getting these goods more cheaply, the consumer has more disposable income to spend on other things, and that this has been growth enhancing. But less than 1 year after Clinton made his speech at Johns Hopkins University, Ben Bernanke was standing up in front of the National Economics Club of New York, making his famous speech that earned him the moniker Helicopter Ben, arguing that deflation was pernicious and it couldn't be allowed to happen in the United States. And why was that important? It was important because inflation targeting, which is what he was talking about, inflation targeting, removed the benefits of free trade from the population at large and concentrated them in the hands of the owners of capital. Because what he was saying is, he's saying we're going to make the overall price level exogenous from global trade. So yes, you might get a cheaper washing machine, but the overall cost of living is going to go up at 2% per annum come what may, and the Federal Reserve will do whatever it has to do to make that happen. So yes, you'll get a cheap washing machine, but you might not be able to send your children to college, or you might not be able to afford a home to live in. Because obviously if they're going to throw money at the economy in order to generate 2% inflation, but the costs of manufactured goods at the margin are being set in China, the cost of labor at the margin is being set in China, then the money is going to stick in the non-tradables. So what you've seen is this bifurcation of inflation, where non-tradable prices have risen, manufacturing prices have fallen, and wage levels have gone nowhere. Now, if the overall cost of living is going to rise at 2% per annum, but your wages aren't going to go up, there's only one consequence that that can have, isn't there? That you're going to get poorer. And what's been interesting is as time has gone on, this negative real income growth has spread from the bottom quintile of the population to the second bottom quintile, and now, all importantly, in a democracy, the third quintile is undergoing real income contraction. So clearly, in a democracy, if 60% of the people are starting to lose, then we've got a problem. And so what I would argue, and what I argue in the book, is that inflation targeting and global trade are antithetical to each other, you know, and that these speeches came 1 year apart. But by targeting inflation, what the Fed did was raised asset prices, therefore reducing home ownership levels. By reducing the future return on financial assets, you were creating an intergenerational wealth inequality. So, for example, if you were a German 30-something at the moment, you were buying government bonds with a negative real yield of 1.5% per annum in order to fund your old age income. So it is going to cost you somewhere between 3 and 4 times the cost of the previous generation to buy the same pension. Okay? So the really important things to people are getting more expensive as a result of this mix of global trade and inflation targeting. But worse than that, I think, and potentially more dangerous, has been that China's apparent success in growing its economy and the apparent weakness of the Western model that has come about as a consequence of things like the global financial crisis, which I think is directly attributable to the interaction of inflation targeting global trade, has led to the statist mercantilist model being held up as a potential alternative for third countries. And this starts to create, I think, geopolitical friction. And it was inevitable that if China was going to take the sort of market share in global manufacturing that it has done, that it was going to suck into its orbit its suppliers and its customers. And China has been very clever in using geoeconomic tools in order to exert influence over third countries. So if I could just move to the conclusions before we open up to the panel discussion. The deep market economic reforms that it was hoped for would be produced by economic engagement in China simply haven't happened. And worse than that, I think, this prosperity that was generated and the speed with which China grew in the aftermath of WTO, far from inducing political change, which was the stated intention of Western leaders who were arguing in favor of it, far from producing that change, it's actually cemented the Communist Party in power, because they bask in the glory of that economic success. So the legitimacy of the CPC has been enhanced. China now has this oligopolistic grip on global manufacturing, which has been brought about in part by the MNC investment in the country. And you have a situation where this statist model is starting to triumph or being held up as an alternative. But Western societies have been left divided, poorer, or poorer for the majority anyway. And we're starting to now risk the rejection of a sort of liberal, free market-orientated economic model at the ballot box. And that is what we are witnessing, I believe, at the moment. And so I suppose I'll leave you with a couple of questions, really. You know, was it ever the case that economic engagement with China was going to be compatible with social harmony? The Chinese effectively did not, were worried that the economic reforms that were required were resulting in disharmony at home. Did they actually just effectively export that to the Western world through the trade model that they pursued? Did perhaps multinational corporations come to dominate the legislative process to such a degree that they were able to push a political agenda that was debilitating to the national interest? And actually, perhaps more pertinently going forward and looking at events in Buenos Aires and beyond, is there actually an economic relationship to be had between two political economies that are so starkly different and have such stark different value systems as the People's Republic of China and Western societies. And so I'll stop there, and thank you very much.